In a previous video, we mentioned that the Roman legions would rotate their front to present fresh troops to the enemy, either to hold a position or to start a pursuit. Now, how did they do it? This is a question that, unfortunately, no one can answer with total certainty. There are various theories, and their followers defend them vehemently, but the truth is that no one knows who is right. Even the fact that units could be exchanged has also been questioned. In this video, I am going to present various theories and give my opinion on them and on which one I believe was used, because I do believe there was a relay. Before starting the video, I invite you to pause it and leave in the comments how you think they did it. And then watch the video and check if what you thought is one of the theories that explain it, if you agree with me or if you have thought of a new theory. Let's get started. First, I want to mention that the relief of the front is only possible when there is a very clear organization like the Roman one, which reaches a level as small as the centuries. For example, an exchange of phalanxes would be impossible. First of all, because they are very slow, and walking backwards in such a tight formation would make them even slower, which would give the enemy time to get into the gap and attack the sides of those who remain at the front. And remember that a phalanx is very weak if it is attacked from a flank. So we have our legion, which, as I said in a previous video, is in a chessboard formation. Let's start looking at the various theories that exist and the problems they present. The first theory holds that the Romans fought in this formation, leaving a gap the size of a maniple between each of the real maniples, those that are in front. In this way, when they want to relieve the front, the princes simply have to advance and make contact with the enemy. At that moment, the Hastatis can retreat, and voila, the relief has been successfully carried out. But I think this has an obvious problem, and that is if the enemy fights irregularly, they could slip through these gaps. Let's say, for example, they are fighting against the Lusitanians of Viriato. They would see the possibility of slipping in and attacking the front from the sides. And since the gap is large, it would be difficult for the Romans to get them out of there. An alternative to this theory is that the second line, that is, the line of the princes, attacks a few seconds after the Hastati clash with the enemy. This, if analyzed well, is not so far-fetched. If you are a soldier, again, Lusitanian, who does not fight in formation, and you see that the Roman army is charging you, but there are huge gaps in its front, you will surely position yourself in front of those gaps to avoid receiving the charge yourself. Many of your comrades would think the same. So weak points will be generated in the areas where the front maniples are located, but 5 seconds later, those pockets self-generated by the enemy would receive the charge of the princes, so those warriors would be practically surrounded and would be in a death zone. In fact, we can think that this is even an improved wedge formation, because here no brave, no kamikaze in quotes is needed at the tip, but it is a solid front. Everything comes up to here, but I'll note something. If the enemies are smart and coordinated, they can let the Hastatis get deep into their lines and then close ranks and surround them. But let's suppose that doesn't happen and everything goes well. The problem is, how do you relieve the front? We know that the Triarii usually didn't fight, so there's no one who can relieve the front. Therefore, I believe this theory is not applicable because it also doesn't explain how to relieve it. If the Triarii went into combat, it doesn't explain how the Hastati or princes would retreat to let them pass. Let's propose something different. What if instead of the princes forming the second line, it were the Hastati themselves? That is, it would be formed in this way. The recent attack could still be a threat, and there could also be a succession by the princes. There would no longer be gaps in the front as at the beginning, or there would be. When a maniple withdrew to be relieved, there would be a gap of about 15 meters in the front, which is a gap wide enough for a large number of enemies to slip through and overflow the front. To correct this problem, we are going to make use of another of the existing theories. This is that, instead of relieving the maniples, they were relieved by centuries. There are two ways to do this. Do you remember there was a later century and an earlier one? This refers to there being one century behind another, so we could assume that the front was such. To distinguish the centuries, the later ones will have a yellow line and the earlier ones a green one. The later centuries fought side by side, and when they had to be relieved, they were replaced by the earlier centuries. The gap that was left was 7 meters. It was a narrow gap, and when only one century moved, the change was relatively quick. But here comes a problem. The measures I've been talking about are based on the assumption that each legionnaire had 2.5 feet to fight. If we multiply this, for example, by 10 legionnaires wide in the century, it gives 25 feet, which converted to meters is about 7 meters more or less. If we multiply these 7 meters by the 10 maniples, we get 70 meters. Plus the small gaps that may be between each one, let's say 80 meters in total front. This leaves us with a relatively narrow front. We can solve it in the following way. Roman literature also names the posterior and anterior centuries as the sinister and dexter centuries respectively, that is, left and right, so we can deduce that they fought side by side. Therefore, the last theory, which in my opinion is the correct one and perhaps the most widespread, postulates that the posterior and anterior centuries fought side by side. This is independent of whether the legions could do what I mentioned before, where in a century, let's suppose the posterior charges and seconds later the anterior does. What brings new to this theory is that the centuries will be relieved one by the centuries of princes who would be behind. As we see on screen, the previous century would retire and place itself behind the next, and in its place the previous century of the princes would be placed. Next, the subsequent century of the princes would place itself behind its predecessor, and the centuries of Hastati would retreat backwards to make way for the subsequent century of princes. I know I just repeated the word century, previous, subsequent, but I hope that supported by the screen the explanation has been more or less clear. The resulting gap is only 7 meters, so it could not be used by the enemy. This theory combines the idea of a wide front plus the idea that the gaps needed to be small so that the enemy could not take advantage of them. As I said at the beginning, it is not known how the Romans did it, so my opinion is just that, an opinion. I invite you to leave in the comments which of the theories you believe is the true one and whether or not you agree with me. Hit like if you liked it and subscribe to stay up to date with new videos.